Welcome to Lesson 5, Document Design. Make sure before you watch this presentation, you read Chapter 6 in your book, pages 217 to 255. It talks a lot about design. So once you're done with that, we can move on. Good document design can make the difference between a mediocre or even bad document and a good one. Even if you have the content in your document, if you design it poorly, it's still going to come across badly. It's sad, but true. The main idea to keep in mind when designing documents for business is scannability. Yes, I know that technically Word doesn't think that that's a word, but I think it's the most descriptive term you can use for designing business documents. They must be easily scanned by the reader. Think about when you open up a textbook to read 20 pages and there are no pictures, very few paragraph or section breaks, and the like. Your stomach kind of drops and you kind of dread reading the book. It's the same in the professional world. Nobody wants to plow through a document with little white space or variation. In fact, many people reading business documents, if not all people, are pressed for time. If you make your document so that a person can easily scan it for the most important points, it will come across much better to the reader. Effective design is appealing, it looks good, it's logically organized, all the same or similar information or elements are grouped, clear, which means it's easy to understand, accessible, anyone can look at it and understand it, varied, it's not repetitive. That is, there's a difference in headings, lists, and other elements, and it's relevant. The design relates to the content. You wouldn't put a resume on pink flowered paper. On the other hand, bad design is crowded, everything's jumbled together, disorganized with no logical flow, hard to follow, it might jump around and make it hard to understand what the content is about, difficult to read, that's pretty obvious what that means, boring, repetitious, the same kinds of elements are used over and over again, inconsistent, heading, spacing, and other elements are not related and vary for no reason. In the book on pages 219 to 222, there are two documents. One is an example of a poorly designed document, the other is much better. Take a look at those and see the difference. Now that you have a visual in your head about what good design is, let's talk about the three main elements to keep. Is the font that you use, the weights of the fonts, the size of the fonts, and the like. The layout, how much white space you use, the alignment of different elements, and the grouping of the elements. And visuals like pictures, graphs, charts, and other pictorial elements. In this lesson, I want to focus mainly on typography and layout. Visuals are really an entire other discussion. We'll mention them, but if you're really interested in how to use effective visuals, read the section in the book that deals with them. Let's look at an example. If you go to this website called visualmess.com, you'll come up with two different side-by-side pictures. These two side-by-side document comparisons, they each have the same information and therefore the same topic, but which one looks cleaner and easier to read? If you said the one on the right, you're right. It's a much cleaner design. It's as if your eye knew instinctively where to go when you looked at the document versus the one on the left, where you tend to jump all over not knowing what to focus on. With the one on the right, it's much easier to discern what information is the most important and how the information logically goes together. This is because the page is laid out well. So this brings us to our first element of design. Page layout involves using white space, headings, font size, logical grouping, and anything else that helps your brain organize information into logical chunks. When we look at a document, our brains automatically start trying to find logic in what we're seeing. With good design, your document will make that process easier for the reader. And this doesn't just go for documents with visuals or pictures. White space is just as important when you're only using text. For example, look at these two documents. The first one is mostly just text all put together. But if you're trying to create a document that's easier for a reader to understand and more scannable, you need to do a better job of organizing all the text. Professional audiences need to be able to understand and skim a document at a quick glance. So if this is the before, this is an example of a better document. It's all of the same information, but laid out in a much nicer way. I added a few blank lines. I changed the indents and alignment on some of the paragraphs. I broke up some of the information into a bulleted list and changed the headings and ways. But it's a totally different and hopefully much more readable document. Here are some guidelines for creating good page layouts. First, use white space. Too much print all in one place is distracting. Remember, white space psychologically helps the reader. It attracts attention, assures the information is logical, and announces the information is easy to follow. Next, make sure all of your documents have adequate margins, 1 to 1.5 inches. Documents that tend to run off the side of the page are harder to understand. Make sure your line length is adequate. 10 to 14 words or 50 to 70 characters is the max. You don't want to cram too much in one line. And use columns if it's necessary. Sometimes it's a lot easier to lay out information in column format. You can get more on the page, but it organizes much easier. Page layout can be tricky. Don't use too much white space or your document will look sparse and poorly designed. But if you use too little, it will look cramped and confusing. There's a sweet spot right in the middle that you should hit. So here are another couple of examples of good and bad page layout. The first one is bad layout, and I found it on an art and design blog by an artist named Donovan Olson. Can you see why it's bad? The product blends into the background. The layout is asymmetrical and the design doesn't flow. There are too many different sizes of fonts. Your eye doesn't know where to go. You're not sure if you need to look at the picture, at the top text, at the bottom text. Seems like there's too much information on the right-hand side. It's not a good layout. So let's look at another one from the same blog, and it's an example of a good layout. This layout's much better. It's much more symmetrical with equal balance on both sides of the page. White space, color, and font size are all used effectively. It's much more pleasing to look at, and you know right away what the ad is for. Page layout is probably the #1 thing you have control of in your documents. Don't ignore it. Sometimes it takes just as long to format as it does to write. For the example that I gave that I just made, it took longer to format than to write it. Make it part of your writing process. It's as much part of revision as changing your text around is. This is to our second element of design, which is font. Choose your fonts wisely in your documents, or else you get odd, unsettling results, like this. You can read logically what the message says, but you can't calm down because the font is so bold and harsh. Make sure your font is appropriate for your message. So what font do you want to use? When using Word, obviously you have a bazillion fonts to choose from. Which one should you pick? You could go with a serif font like Times New Roman or a sans serif font like Calibri. Serif fonts are based on typewriter letters, and the flourishes at the edges make the words run together, which can make them a little easier to read. Sans serif fonts, on the other hand, have no flourishes, so the letters stand apart. The one thing to remember is never use Comic Sans, ever. No matter what you choose, make sure it's not Comic Sans. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, which one should you use? Oh, not Curls, Papyrus, or Brush Script either. Try to stay away from decorative fonts or fonts that look like a kid wrote them. It's not professional. So which one should you use? Back to the original question. The answer is you choose. It may be up to you. You can do a web search to see what's the most professional font, but you're going to find conflicting information. I found a website that said you should use Arial or Helvetica for email. 2 other websites said never to use Arial. Somewhere else said Times New Roman is good for documents. Another said that Times New Roman looks lazy. The upshot is it's really up to you. Just stay away from curly or decorative fonts. Garamond, Helvetica, Arial, or Times New Roman will all work fine, or any other clean-looking font. Examples of appropriate fonts are found on page 224 if you want more specific guidelines. Personally, I use Calibri for my documents, mainly because I like that the font is a little different than the normal Arial, and I think it might be the default in Word. In all honesty, I don't think Helvetica is actually standard in Word anymore, so you may have a problem finding that. So when you're using font, what's the thing to remember? The first thing is you need to think about your weight. Weight means bold, underline, or italics. But remember that less is usually more. It's good to use contrast and varying size in order to make an impact and have certain words set off from the others, but too much contrast will make your document look busy. Pick a standard size 10 or 12 font for the text of your document and bump your headings up to 14 or 15 at most. Also vary the weight of the headings and subheadings. If you look back to my sample document, The subheadings are in italics, whereas the headings are in bold. The idea that less is more also goes for color. See the sections guidelines for using color on page 227, but in general, don't use more than 2 colors in a document. So that's it for typography, except for one last font. Don't use Comic Sans, ever. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk at least a little bit about using effective visuals. However, I stress again that I'm not a visual designer, and this is not a graphics class, in case you hadn't figured that out from my fantastic PowerPoint presentations. Please read the part in the book about visuals for more complete information. Honestly, we could probably talk about visuals and design in general for an entire semester, and people that are in graphic design do. Actually, multiple semesters. If you want a really quick crash course in visuals, remember that pictures can be worth 1,000 words. They're good for condensing and showing information. Use them wisely to show quick information and data in your document. Now, pictures, graphs, tables, or other visuals should also be relevant. Try not to throw in pictures for the sake of having them. Better to have none and concentrate on good layout and typography than let irrelevant pictures try to spice up the design. Also, label your visuals. Make sure you explain tables and graphs and say where you get your pictures. For tables and graphs, mention them in the text. Don't just stick them in there and never talk about them. Mention them before you put them in the document. So you should have a paragraph describing your visual, and then the visual should follow the actual paragraph. I also wanted to briefly mention infographics. Infographics are becoming a much more common means of communicating, especially in online content. They are pictures that double as a document. Let's look at one for example. This infographic is from the American Heart Association about childhood obesity. There's a lot of data presented in a visually pleasing manner. It comes across easily and is scannable, much more so than just paragraphs about the topic. In many ways, infographics are taking the place of pamphlets. Since so much information is delivered electronically anymore, there needed to be a good graphical way to do this. You'll note that this could be printed out at any size and hung up, or passed around at a seminar or conference. Make sure, though, if you ever do use or distribute an infographic, it's okay. Make sure they're not copyrighted and you're not violating any copyrights. I'll also upload a couple more examples to the Lesson 5 page. Just remember, with infographics, you have data mixed with verbiage, all organized in a sort of chart with a color. See, a picture really is worth 1,000 words. I can't even effectively describe the word infographic. The problem with infographics is that they can be really difficult to design. A lot of these are designed by graphic designers, and they're people that have had entire years studying how to do good design. It's not something that you can sit down and do quickly if you don't know what you're doing. But you can still use some of the guidelines of design for a pamphlet or a flyer by looking at good infographics. There's so much more to say about design, but again, this is not a design class. There are multiple books you can buy and websites you can refer to if you ever find yourself in a situation that really requires a lot of hardcore design. One good resource is the book, The Non-Designer's Design Book. I have that one and it's very useful. I also have a book called Presentation Zen I've been using to improve my PowerPoint slides. I don't know if it's working or not, but it's a nice resource. There are plenty of other resources out there. Just go on Amazon or go on a website, pick around, see what you can find. Don't be afraid to consult some if you really need some design help. Here are all the citations for this presentation.